Welcome to Mindset Tools Mastery. I'm David Phelan, and in this presentation, Memory Magic Part 1, we're going to focus on a set of tools that you can use both to help you to resolve problems and also to accomplish results. There's a lot of content in this particular topic, and so I've divided it into two parts, and the second set of tools we'll address in a later presentation. Before I share this set of tools, there are a few principles that I think are helpful to understand about how the mind works. So we'll talk about those principles and then talk about the tools themselves. And so in order to describe this first principle, I'd like to do an exercise with you. And that is that I want you to think about food that you really enjoy eating. Like if I were to say to you, what's your favorite food? So I want you to think a moment and what's something that you would really enjoy eating. Now I'm going to ask you to do this exercise with me. Keep in mind, if you've eaten recently, the effect of this exercise may not be as robust, but just do the best that you can with it. So as you think about that food, I want you to close your eyes and imagine eating that food. Imagine taking a bite. And as you do that, think about the sensation that you would experience on your lips and your tongue. Think about the texture of the food. Think about the flavors swirling around in your mouth. Think about how pleasant it would be to swallow. Imagine taking another bite that's even better than the first. Imagine that it's just really, really good. And as you do that, notice what starts to happen in your mouth. And go ahead and open your eyes. If you're like most people that I work with, when I have them imagine eating their favorite food, they notice that their mouth waters. Now, if you have that experience, that's a really big deal that a lot of people don't recognize. Their mouth waters and they don't even recognize that their mouth is watering. Or if they do recognize it, they don't really get what that means. If your mouth was watering, you were having a physiological reaction, the production of saliva, to something that wasn't real. There was no food there. And what that means is the body doesn't know the difference between what's real and what's vividly imagined. As we go through these tools, that principle, the body doesn't know the difference between what's real and what's vividly imagined, is key. If you were going to write something down, that's the thing that you want to write down. Now, what do I mean by that? They've done some interesting experiments related to this principle. In one experiment, they had a woman look at a picture of a flower and then a scan of her brain. And what they were looking for is what parts of the brain light up when she is looking at this flower. And then in the second part of the experiment, they took the flower away, the image of the flower away, and they asked her to recall the image of the flower. And what they were looking for is what parts of the brain light up with recall. So what parts of the brain are associated with memory. But when they compared the two brain images were identical. What that means is the brain doesn't differentiate between what it sees and what it recalls having seen. The body doesn't know the difference. The brain doesn't know the difference between those two. Now, the reason that's so important is because we're thinking about things all the time that aren't real. When I say real, I mean here and now. Me making this presentation, you listening to this presentation, right? We can think about things that have happened in the future. We can think about things that have happened in the past. But those things aren't happening right now. And the challenge with that is our body doesn't know they're happening right now. So they did an extension of that experiment where they had a person and they asked him to sit still, and they did a scan of his brain. And as he was sitting still, they said, instructed him not to think about anything in particular, just to sort of relax, be comfortable. In the second part of the experiment, they asked him to play notes on a piano, and they did a second scan of his brain. And when you compare those two brain scans, those two scans are very different. In the third part of the experiment, they asked him once again to sit still, but this time to think about playing notes on the piano. And they did a third scan of the brain. And the scan of him playing the notes and thinking about playing the notes are identical. The body doesn't know the difference between what's real and what's vividly imagined. Now, this is the kind of principle that athletes have known for forever, and psychologists have only discovered more recently. Anytime a coach has ever said to an athlete, visualize your performance, visualize the execution of what you're trying to do, they're utilizing this principle. There was some research that was done with downhill slalom skiers, where they took a group of skiers who were all competing at about the same level, took them to a new downhill slalom course, and they broke the group into two smaller groups. And one group went down a set number of times, and I can't remember the number exactly, it was 6 or 8 times. And then the second group went down half as many times, but then they visualized the other half. And at the end, their performance was compared. The group that had visualized was skiing just as well as the group that had actually gone down more times. So again, that idea, the body doesn't know the difference between what's real and what's vividly imagined, can be used to our advantage. The reality is that's at work in us all the time. Sometimes we're able to use it to our advantage. Sometimes it works against us. An example of it working against us would be something like PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. I was once working with a client who had just gotten back from war in Iraq. And it was around the time that here in the Phoenix area, we had photo radar on the freeways. And he said to me, you know that flash that you see when the photo radar camera goes off? He said, that's the same flash that I saw when an IED exploded, right? The flash of the camera would go off and his mind would go back to the battlefield, and his body didn't know that he wasn't on the battlefield. The body doesn't know the difference. So his heart would start pounding, he started pouring sweat, and that kind of thing can become very debilitating. So that principle is at work in us all the time. If we know that principle, then we're able to use it to our advantage. And when we get to the tools, I want to talk about how to use it to our advantage. Now, the other thing that I want to talk about is how the mind deals with time. And I alluded to that a minute ago, and I want to spend a little bit more time with that. So when I talk about time, what I'm referring to specifically is past, present, and future, and how the mind deals with that. So I'm going to talk about it first in terms of the future, then we'll apply it to the past, and then we'll think about the present. So I want you to think about your week coming up, like the next 7 days, and I want you to think about something that's going to happen in the next 7 days, an event that you're going to be at, something that you're going to do. And as you do that, I want you to imagine that going poorly. And I just want you to notice how that feels. Okay, now get rid of that thought. And now imagine it going well. And think about how that feels. Were you able to detect a difference in the way that those two felt? Right? Now, you can ask yourself the question, which one of those two is real? Well, the answer is neither one of them is real, right? The event that you're thinking about hasn't actually happened. But the question is, again, does the body know that, right? So when we think about something that has the potential to happen in the future, we may think about it going well, we may think about it going poorly, but our body is going to respond as if that event is already happening, because the body doesn't know the difference between what's real and what's vividly imagined. So we can see that the future isn't real, it's only something that's happening in our mind. And so when I talk to people about the future, the word that I use is an illusion. Okay, so have you ever seen an illusionist like David Copperfield or Shin Lim or somebody like that? When the illusionists are really good, the experience that we have is, I know that's not real, but I can't see how it's done. And it's very entertaining. Okay. If you've ever seen a bad illusionist, it's like, I can see what you're doing. And, unless that's done for comedy, which can be entertaining of itself, bad illusions are not very entertaining, right? So in our mind, the future is not real. So it has that quality of illusion. And yet, with a good illusionist, the illusion is compelling. It looks real. And so the future in our mind is like that compelling illusion that most of the time, it doesn't even occur to us. We're not even thinking about what's in our mind is not real. We're thinking about the future, it's not real. And so that's why I call it a compelling illusion. So the thoughts about the future in our mind are not real. How about our thoughts of the past? So the question is, where does the past exist? We might be more inclined to think that the past is real, but you can probably anticipate the distinction that I'm going to make, that even though it occurred at some point, it's not occurring right now. At the point that it did occur, it was real, but right now it only exists in our memory. And you may know that there are many challenges with our memories. So they've done some experiments with memory, and in one experiment, they had participants in the experiment standing on different corners of an intersection. And then they staged a car accident in the middle of the intersection. Now, the participants thought what they were doing, that the task was to count cars. They didn't know this car accident was coming. And then following the car accident, they asked the participants to describe what happened. And you can probably guess that the descriptions that the experimenters got back were different depending on what corner of the intersection that the person was standing on. So when we think about our memory, again, it doesn't occur to us most of the time that the memory that we hold in our mind, even if it's accurate, is only accurate from a certain perspective. Not all perspectives are included in our memory. And now, I mentioned even if it's accurate. Well, the challenge with that is that memory at times can be very inaccurate. So let me give you a few examples of that. There was an experiment done, and I'm not sure exactly why car accidents is used as much as it is, but this is another car accident experiment where the participants in the experiment watched a video of a car accident. And then everybody got a set of questions. And all of the questions were the same except for one question. And this variation divided the group into two smaller groups. One of the smaller groups got the question, how fast were the cars going when they collided? The other group got the question, how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other? Right now, again, the participants think they're asking or answering a question about speed. In the third part of the experiment, so first is watch the video, second is answer a set of questions. Third part of the experiment is to answer another set of questions. And in this set of questions, one of the questions was there any broken glass in the video? The smaller group that had gotten the question were, how fast were the cars going when they smashed into one another? Answered that yes, there was broken glass in the video, when in fact there was no broken glass. So that's an example of a suggestion being made after the fact that gets incorporated into the memory, so the memory becomes distorted. So that's an example of our memories may not be all that accurate. Third example I'd like to share with you is, I used to teach Psych 101, and that's where some of these examples come from. And when we got to this chapter on memory, there was a story that began that chapter. And it was of a woman who I believe was in her 20s at the time. And she was at a party, and she was describing her mother's death. And her mother had drowned in the family swimming pool. And she was talking about finding her mom. and described, her, laying face down in the pool, and was able to describe her clothes. She was wearing a red dress with white polka dots. She had the full description. At the end of the description, her aunt looked at her and said, "You weren't even there." So this woman has this complete memory in her mind of this event that she wasn't even present for. So how did she get that memory? Well, she had heard that story being told by members of the family over and over again. She just lost the attribution. Where did that come from? Was it her firsthand experience, or was it something that she had heard? And as she was hearing it, she created the mental image of it, right? So all of that is to say that our memory is subject to distortion. But again, as we're talking about that first principle, the body doesn't know the difference between what's real and what's vividly imagined. So we have these memories that can be having a very real influence on us, even if those memories are not accurate. So the future in our mind is an illusion. Future isn't real. The past isn't real. At least the images that we have in our mind are different than what actually happened. So if the future is an illusion and the past is an illusion, then what's real? Well, what's real is the present, here and now. And so you've probably heard in social media or just in popular culture references to being in the present moment or being grounded in the present, those kinds of things. The reason that's so important is because the present is the only thing that is real. It's the only thing that is happening. And what's interesting about that, in my opinion, a lot of work that I do with my clients, blends psychology and their faith, is that, in the Christian understanding of God, when God presents himself and gives his name, it's in the story that you might be familiar with of Moses in the burning bush. And Moses is being sent by God to go talk to the Pharaoh. And Moses knows that that's a precarious position for him to be in. And so he's going to go and deliver God's message, and so Moses is asking himself, who should I tell him is calling, kind of thing. And so God gives Moses his name. And the name is Yahweh, right? And how does that translate? How do we translate that? We translate that as I am, right? I am. Not I will be, not I was, but I am. Christians may call God the God who was and is to come, but God calls himself I am. Like the only thing happening is now, I am. Okay, so that's what's real. But again, keep in mind that the body doesn't know the difference between what's real and what's vividly imagined. So the thoughts that we have of the future can have an impact on us. The thoughts that we have from the past can have an impact on us, and they have a very real impact, whether those thoughts are accurate or not. So now I want to give you some examples of tools that we can use related to our memory in particular, and and how we might be able to use that to our advantage. By the way, let me mention one other thing about present moment. Some people, if you are just recognizing this idea about the importance of being in the present moment and you want help with that, there's another presentation that I'm going to do on that. So feel free to check that presentation out. Okay, so tools specifically about memory. So in order to do this, I'd like you to bring a happy memory to mind. And I'll give you a few moments to select one. And I just want to say, sort of from a safety perspective, some people might have difficulty doing that, particularly if you are experiencing depression or you've have a history of trauma. And so, if that applies to you, just know that as we do this work, it's okay to take a break. You're welcome to keep watching if you want to, but however you decide to do that, be gentle with yourself. Also, if you're working with this and you find that you get stuck, you may need assistance working through that difficulty. So my number one priority is always, maintain safety. Okay, so if you were able to come up with a happy memory, I'd like you to think about that memory, to bring it to mind in as much detail as you can. Think about where you were when it was happening, what was going on around you at the time, who else was there, if anybody else, and try to think about what that memory felt like. And as you do that, I want you to rate it on a scale of 0 to 10. If 0 is completely sad, down, depressed, 10 is the most happy, where would you rate it? Okay, so you've got a memory and you've got a rating of it. Okay, now, so what we're saying is that your body doesn't know the difference between what's real and what's vividly imagined, which is why when you bring it to mind, there's an emotional intensity that goes along with that. Okay, now I want to talk about, again, some principles of how the mind works and tools that you can use specifically with a memory like that. So take that memory that you made, and I want you to notice, and this might be helpful to do by closing your eyes. I want you to notice the size of the image that you're holding in your mind. And see if you can take that image and make it smaller. See if you can make it about the size of a postage stamp that's on the ground as you're standing up over it. And as you do that, notice if it changes the intensity. If it's more intense, if it's less intense, or if there's no change. Okay, now take that same image, and I'd like you to imagine that you were sitting in the front row of a movie theater, and that image was up on the big screen. So make that image larger in your mind. And again, notice if there's a change in the intensity. Now, as I do this work, sometimes people have difficulty doing these kinds of changes in their mind. If that's happening, that's okay. Just do the best that you can with it. Sometimes just working with it makes it easier. And even if this is a tool that you're not able to use, that's okay. There are a lot of different tools that we can use. If you were able to make it smaller, did it change the intensity for you? What most people that I work with find is that when they make an image smaller, it makes it feel less intense. When they make it bigger, it makes it feel more intense. Now, why that's important is, again, that our body doesn't know the difference between what's real and what's vividly imagined. How the image actually was when it occurred is not the same as how we're representing it to ourselves right now. If you think about that term recollection, what we do with our memory recollection, that's an accurate description of how the mind actually works, that it's taking different elements like the visual presentation, the sounds of it, the emotional content, and it's building something new right now in the present moment, right? It's recollecting all those different aspects of it. And if we recognize that that's how the mind is working, then we can choose how we want to represent it. If something is unpleasant, we can represent it in a smaller representation. If it's something that's pleasant, we can make it bigger. Now, when I said that most people, that's the way that it works. If you make it smaller, it makes it less intense. If you make it larger, it makes it more intense. But some people are wired in the opposite way. If they make it smaller, it actually feels more intense. I was working with a client one time, and we were talking about an unpleasant image, and he made it smaller, And normally that would make the image less intense, but for him, he said it increased it. He said it felt like he was running away from the problem. And so I said to him and all my clients, how it works with you isn't important. What is important is that you know how it works. So if you're wired differently than most people, that's okay as long as you know how you're wired. So did it make it more intense? Did it make it less intense? And sometimes it won't make a change in the intensity at all. Okay, so that's one way that we can change it. Now, have you ever heard somebody use the expression, you're blowing that out of proportion? You know, when somebody uses that expression, what they're saying is that somebody took something that was not all that important and they made it much bigger than it actually is. More important, more intense. And again, how that's happening is they're increasing the image of it in their mind. They're just literally making the picture bigger. Okay, so the size is one element that we can work with, right? But there are other elements. So close your eyes again, and I want you to think about that image, that happy memory, the way that you made it originally. And this time I want you to notice whether it's more like it's color or more like it's black and white. And now see if you can change it. It was color, try to make it black and white. If it was black and white, try to make it color. And again, just notice if there's a change in the intensity. Okay, and put it back the way that it was originally. Now I want you to think about the clarity of the image. Imagine that you're looking through the lens of a camera and you can change the focus. Imagine making it very out of focus. And as you do that, again, notice the intensity, more intense, less intense, no change. Put it back the way that it was originally. Now I want you to think about the camera angle. Is it more like you're in the picture, seeing things through your own eyes, or is it more like you're outside the picture, watching yourself? And now, again, try changing that. If you're outside, try stepping into the picture and seeing it directly through your own eyes. If you're seeing it through your own eyes, try stepping outside and notice if that changes the intensity. Okay, now put it back the way that it was originally. This time, I want you to think about the sound of the picture. Imagine that you had a volume control and you could turn down the volume, or you could turn up the volume. Try changing the volume and notice how it feels. Okay, where does it make it more intense? Where does it make it less intense? And now put it back the way that it was originally. And now I want you to think about the temperature of the picture. Think about it being much hotter. And notice if that changes the intensity. And for many people, that will sort of take the edge off things if they imagine it being hot and uncomfortable, right? Or imagine being too cold in the situation, right? So try changing the temperature and notice if that changes the way that it feels. Okay, put it back the way that it was originally. Now I want you to think about the aromas of the image, right? Maybe there were pleasant aromas like the smell of food or something like that, right? Somebody's perfume, right? Imagine a really distasteful odor. And notice if that changes the intensity. Or again, a very pleasant odor. And again, put it back the way that it was originally. So as we're working with these ways to change the presentation of it, we're working with the five senses. Does it make sense to you that every memory that we have is going to be based on one or more of the five senses, right? So we started with the visual, and in this work we call them modes. So we start with the visual mode, then we went to the auditory. We did the kinesthetic mode with the temperature. Other things that would be in the kinesthetic mode would be like, is it smooth or is it rough? Is it hard or is it soft? We did the olfactory sense with the pleasant or unpleasant odors. We didn't do the sense of taste, but you probably heard people say things like, that left a bitter taste in my mouth, right? For some people, when they have an unpleasant experience, they actually get a taste of bile. And so what we're saying about this is that every memory is based on one or more of the five senses. It can't be based on something else. And within each of these modes, there are submodalities, like size is a submodality as a visual mode, and volume is a submodality of the auditory mode. And so what happens is, as we change the submodalities, it changes the way that it feels. Now, particularly related to pleasant memories, we might ask ourselves, well, why do we want to do that? If it was a good memory, why do we want to change it? Well, we can change it and use it to our advantage. And I'll explain that in just a minute. By the way, part 2 of the tools, what I'm going to show you is how to take distressing recollections and neutralize them so they don't get in the way of what you're trying to do in the present. Okay, but for right now, let's keep our focus on the pleasant memories. And why would we want to be able to change the representation? So I'll give you an example from my own life. Early in my career, I was working in a psychiatric hospital, and we had a service that we provided to the kids, which was a ropes course. So think of a ropes course like an obstacle course that is set on telephone poles. And so they would use rappelling gear and things like that. And what I found was that it was extremely effective. You know, it's one thing to talk about trust. It's a very different thing to do trust, right? You climb this pole while somebody else, you know, holds the rope for you, right? And so when I saw how powerful it was, I decided to go through the course to become an instructor. And so the training was a week long, and there were 40 other people in the group with me. And the training comprised of going through each of the elements so that you would learn what it was like, both physically and emotionally. And so we got to one element, which was called the pamper pole. Now, the object of the pamper pole is to climb to the top of a 40-foot telephone pole, to stand on the top of it, and to jump 6 feet to a trapeze. Okay, now you have to imagine this, right? You're climbing up, you know, these handholds. You get to the top of the telephone pole, and there's nothing above you to hold on to, right? And so you kind of have to figure out how you're going to get yourself on top of it, right? It's not an easy thing to do. And then you're standing on top of this pole, and the wind is blowing, and so the pole is wrong. It seems like it's swaying a lot. It probably wasn't swaying that much, okay? And then you're going to jump 6 feet to a trapeze, right? Now, it's a very safe thing to do. We're all wearing harnesses and that, but of the 40 people in the group, I was the only person who actually caught the trapeze, right? That was like a killer experience. Okay, good. So I've got this memory that's really powerful. Now, how did I use it? Well, one of the things that I did with it was I polished it. Okay, what do I mean by that? Knowing that the memory is not what was actually happening, I'm just representing it, I can choose how I represent it. So the day was overcast, but I imagine bright blue sky, white puffy clouds. The lawn was kind of burnt out. I imagine it being a vibrant green. I imagine my friends and family standing around the bottom of the pole. I turn up the volume of them cheering for me. I intensify the sensation of grabbing the pole. And as I do that, the feeling associated with it gets stronger and stronger and stronger. Okay, great. Now, what do you do with that? Well, one example of how that can be used is right before I opened my private practice, I was working for a company. There were 3 of us, my supervisor and my receptionist and us, and we were a subsidiary of another company. And so my supervisor left, and I applied for his position. And I found out there were going to be 2 people on the interview board. One is I had never met before. And the other person, the only time I ever saw this woman was I'd only met her 3 times. And the only times I saw her was when there was a huge problem that I had created, right? And she came over from corporate to fix me, right? So how do you think I felt about going into this interview, right? It was kind of nerve-wracking. And so, I used a lot of the tools that I've shared with you, and this one in particular of using this polished image, bringing that to mind and that sensation of yes. And right before I gave the interview, I walked in and I was able to give a great interview, right? So we can take our positive memories and enhance them and use them to our advantage. There are two additional ways that we can use it to our advantage, and I'm just going to describe them briefly. We're not going to actually do them. One is that what some authors call the slingshot method or technique, and that is to take a positive image like a success that you've experienced and use that to visualize breaking through some kind of limitation that you have. So it could be like a bad habit, like biting your nails or smoking or overeating, or it could be, not being able to follow through on something that you're trying to accomplish. And so you can visualize one image breaking through the other. And if you do that repeatedly, when you are about to engage in the undesirable behavior, that success is what comes to mind, and it can be helpful in being able to get the results that you actually want. So that's another example of how it can be used. And a third way of how it can be used is a technique called emotional waves. And that's a situation where somebody takes a number of positive memories that they have, and they visualize those memories as images coming towards them. And as they come towards them, the image gets larger and feels more intense, and then kind of smashes into them. And when they visualize that, the experience is like being filled up with that feeling. And when we visualize that over and over and over again, because again, the body doesn't know the difference between what's real and what's vividly imagined, we're able to experience that enhanced state. And particularly if we're trying to do something that's really difficult, being in an enhanced state like that can be very helpful. So I'm going to save the emotional waves and slingshots for other presentations, and we'll all actually walk those through. But for now, just know that there are a number of different things that we can do with that. I want to give you one more exercise, and I know this presentation is going a little bit longer than the other ones, but one more exercise that we can do with it. What I'd like you to do is to take a minute and to see if you can come up with 5 more happy memories. And then I'll show you what we're going to do with those. And the happy memories can be about anything. They can be happy events like a birthday or a Christmas or a vacation. They can be accomplishments. They could be great conversations that you had with someone. Okay, so think about creating a list of happy memories. If you've ever watched the evening news, and particularly like the sports segment, often what you get is the best plays of a game, right? What we might call the highlights reel. So as you're identifying these happy memories, what you're capturing is the highlights reel of your life. And one of the things that makes that so valuable, it is short of, something physically happening to your brain. Those memories are going to be with you. It's like, somebody can take your money, but they can't take your happy memories, right? And so you're identifying this list. Now, we've talked in a previous presentation about the benefits of state-dependent recall, and we applied that to rehearsing gratitude. Well, you can do the same thing with rehearsing happy memories. So you look at the happy memory, you try to feel the experience of that, feel the emotion of it, right? You go through each one of them. And what most people find when they do that is from the beginning of that to the end, they actually feel happier. Now, why, again, would that be important? Well, there are many situations where feeling happier would be helpful. Like the interview that I gave is one example. But imagine that you are getting ready to do a difficult situation, like maybe it's a conversation with somebody that is going to be challenging. Well, sort of preparing yourself and getting yourself into an enhanced state can actually make that conversation go better, right? It's not going to control what the other person says or does, But what it can do is help you in your reactions, right? If you're in a better state to begin with, that situation is going to go the best that it can go. Now, so it can help you to prepare for a difficult situation. It can also help you in the middle of a difficult situation. If you're, sometimes the difficulties happen and we're not even expecting them, right? But if we're familiar with rehearsing our happy memories, and in the middle of that difficulty, we can bring something to mind that was pleasant, again, it can help us through that difficulty. Now, keep in mind, in the middle of episodes, in the middle of difficulty, it's the most difficult time to do something. So just know that even if you want to be able to change your thinking in that way, you may not be able to. Don't beat yourself up for that. Just know that that's normal. And we can get to that place, but it just might require more practice, right? We can also use our pleasant memories, our happy memories, as a recovery after we go through a difficult situation, right? The situation might end, but you might still be carrying the stress of it, carrying the frustration with it. And if we can change our thinking about that from that unpleasantness to a pleasant memory, it can get us out of that stuck state that we can be in. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't something that we need to address. We might need to confront somebody. We might need to take steps to handle a problem, the difficult situation. But what I'm suggesting is that whatever it is that we need to do is going to go better if we're in an emotional state that's in alignment with the outcome that we're trying to get to. So we can apply it to problems. So at the beginning of the presentation, I asked you to think about problems that you have, and we can apply it to those problems, right? We can apply it as prevention for the difficulty. We can apply it as an intervention in the middle of it. We can apply it for recovery. But we can also apply it for the goals that we're working on. Being able to create those positive recollections in our mind prepare us for whatever it is that we're working on. If you can easily bring to mind 10 accomplishments, then the goal that you're working on becomes more possible. And a recent example of that was I was working with a young man, and he has some social anxiety, and he was talking about having applied for this position. He got the position, and now he's going to go and do orientation. But the thought that was going through his mind is, I don't know if I can handle that, right? So I asked him if he had ever done anything difficult, and he said yes. And so I asked him to write a list of difficult things that he had done that he thought he'd done well, and he came up with 8 of those. And so again, I asked him to rehearse those, bring each one of those to mind, think about it, try to really feel what that felt like. And he went through all 8 of them. And then I said to him, okay, and now what do you think about orientation? And his response was great. He said, piece of cake, right? So we can use our happy memories to set us up to be able to accomplish the things that are important to us. So again, keep in mind the principles. Our body doesn't know the difference between what's real and what's vividly imagined. If it's not happening here and now, it's not real. And if it's not real, then we have a choice about how we represent it to ourselves. We can change the submodalities to change the representation. And then as we change the representation, we can apply that in a number of different ways. So if you want to find out more about that, please feel free to reach out, and I'd be happy to address that with you.